All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome in. Just going to give a few minutes for make sure we get everybody in this morning. Appreciate everybody joining on a Tuesday morning at the end of the month and the week of July 4th as well. Right, I think looks like we have getting most people in here. We'll give it a few more seconds. Just others joining in. I want to make sure we have as many as possible that are attending in the room before we get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here this morning. So again, thanks everybody for joining. My name is Jeff Garrett. I'm VP of Solutions Architecture here at Opkalla. And I have with me today Matt Capone, who is our cybersecurity architect. We're going to be talking a little bit about AI security and just securing the AI landscape. I know this is a popular topic amongst our current customers, and hopefully some of you that may not be familiar with us, we'll dive into why we're seeing this, what's going on in the market. Just some of the questions that are coming up from the people that we're working with, and hopefully we'll give everybody a little bit more insight into just what's going on with security around AI. Matt, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself to everybody so they know who's leading the charge here this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So, like Jeff said, I'm Matthew Capone. I'm the cybersecurity architect here at Opkalla. Really, a lot of my job here, right, is working with any kind of stakeholders, identifying areas of risk when it comes to their cybersecurity roadmap or projects they're working on as they relate to business objectives. So, like Jeff was saying, I think everybody's aware of AI adoption. Looking for answers of how to go about that in a secure manner. So hoping that we can provide, some of the things that we're seeing, the types of conversations we're having, and ultimately provide some useful information on how to approach secure adoption in your environment.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate that. And we're just going to jump right in. And so for those that those that may not know us, I want to take a few slides here just to give a quick intro on who Opkalla is. So we're a technology advisory firm. We're a little bit different than probably what you've seen in the past in this area. And so we're really trying to make sure that what we do is we come in a vendor neutral stance, sitting on our customer side of the table to help them evaluate their technology needs around their business strategy. So rather than coming in with any particular vendor attached to us, we're coming in that neutral fashion to make sure we're listening to what your needs are, what your business use cases are, what the goals of your business are, what the goals of your organization for future state are, and helping technology and helping different departments align to that from a technology need. And we do that by going into our portfolio of, at this point, I think we're over 600 providers in our portfolio officially, but we can add to that at any time. I think we have done a great job of making our processes nimble enough that when customers come to us and maybe we see a need to bring in new vendors to our portfolio, we can. So again, going with that vendor neutral approach. We do this through our core values of trust, transparency, and speed. So we hope that we build that trust with our customers because we are transparent and because, again, I talk about those nimble actions of speed across the board. These are some of our core areas that we play in. So you see probably a lot of top areas here. Today, we're kind of merging a couple and that we're talking in the cybersecurity space, but around AI and data. And as you get to know us, and for those that maybe have known us and been through a few of these, something that we do as an architecture team We can come in and have do talk tracks and workshops around certain areas that cover a lot of these engagements. Our kill chain around cybersecurity is one. We have an enterprise cloud talk track. We also have an AI and data talk track. So we're going to kind of double click and zoom in on that today. So this is a couple of slides from our AI and data talk track, just as a little bit of a teaser. And we talk about AI and data with our customers. You can see that these are some of the common challenges that we're typically talking through that we hear from a lot of organizations. And that last one down there on the bottom right, security and trust, is become a big topic. It has become one of the main topics around AI. So much so that when we put together our framework of how we align to where our customers are at on their journey, we really put security in our phase zero. So in a greenfield approach, if everything was a perfect world and you were starting from net zero, that security should be the first thing you're talking about. Now, what we realistically find is that a lot of our customers are in phase two. They've kind of jumped right into AI operationalization. It's point products that have come in, which is the way most of us will probably consume AI outside of building many things ourselves or building LLMs ourselves, but a lot of jump straight there, and it's things like Copilot that fall into this, a productized offering of AI. And now we're trying to go back to make sure they put the proper security controls in place. So whether you've jumped into some of these phases or you're starting for Greenfield, hopefully you find this valuable of thinking about how can I put security in place? How can I come in with a layered approach into security for my AI rollout and what I'm hoping to accomplish in AI. So with that in mind, let's jump right into it. So we are going to be talking about AI security in an approach of looking at it in layers today. And Matt, one of the things I want to start with is why do we want to talk about it like that? Why a layered approach to AI security from a Opkalla stance?
Yeah, Jeff, I think that is the perfect question to kind of start this with because the reality of this idea of AI adoption is while it's a great thing of optimizing efficiency and productivity, you're introducing quite a few different, really expanding the threat landscape at the end of the day is what's happening. And you see that across your data plane, identity and authentication, but also at the end user level of user governance, right? Because what has happened is the bar to productivity when it comes to using technology has been lowered. And so now we have another threat landscape that we need to secure, but also expanding in how that threat landscape can propagate a network potentially or data sets.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And one thing before we jump in to our layers, I do want to remind everyone that if you have questions, feel free to throw them out there throughout this. We will try to leave some time at the end to answer all questions or as many as we can. You can feel free to throw them there as we go, but we won't answer live. We'll get through this. We want to make sure we get through all areas and then can jump into questions. So first place we're starting with today is usage governance. So controlling what AI can be used and how. And Matt, what usage governance? What problem do we see that we're ultimately trying to solve here?
Yeah, the first problem really is more so how many AI applications, models are available to an end user's fingertips, right at the keyboard. The first thing you're really trying to get here is away from the idea of shadow usage, moving away from unsanctioned applications, unsanctioned AIs, and moving to approved AIs that users can use for approved use cases. Think of this more as how are we trying to do, acceptable use policies, but also when we talk about how controls are implemented, this is really more preventative. We are putting enforcement in place to really force people to use what has been approved by the business.
No, that so, and I think in that, Matt, we want to get people down the route of those approved business AIs, but talk a little bit about what maybe we're seeing is the risk that exists for. So if an organization are wondering, understand like, but why block these things? Why have those? What are some of the risks we see that come about with unapproved AI tools?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is data in motion, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit, as we go through the layers as well, really in depth throughout, right? But at the end of the day, it's the idea that if somebody can take information, whether that's PII or some kind of, IP, or even highly regulated, information when we get to some of the other industries, right? Um, the idea is this starts really as a guardrail to prevent improper disclosure. We want to make sure that information that cannot open up the business to any kind of legal or reputational based uh, reactions or risk that are under control, right? So I think one of the things I mentioned earlier was we often see the beginning of this as defining an internal policy of what's acceptable use. And then, from there, you kind of want to be able to put the enforcement rules in place to make sure that that policy is actually working. Mostly because once you get into the usage aspect of things, there's control that you start to lose. And that's around, whether models are training on data, whether that data can be available to somebody, who's not internal to the company. Just you're opening up to an avenue of a lot of unknown unknowns. And that's typically not a place that you want to operate. That tends to be where risk grows more rampant, and risk that's unchecked in a lot of ways can often transition to potential exploitation or disclosures.
That's great, and I think that one thing for me for this is this is not this governance of applications is something that shouldn't be new to organizations. We've started down this path a lot when we talk about SaaS-based applications, leading up to this point in governing the usage of SaaS-based applications, but really trying to discover what was out there. And a lot of that was done by organizations for cost control mechanisms and consolidation of apps. And I think the introduction of AI has really brought a sense of um, alarm to some extent, but just awareness of I really need to pay attention to what's going out there. And I think that transitions well into kind of our next layer as we talk about that usage is the actual data protection, and being more aware of data. So, Matt, data security posture management again is something that I think we talked about a lot in SaaS when we were talking about securing ourselves with SaaS and shared responsibility models, but maybe has gained more awareness. So what role does data security posture management do you think plays in AI security now?
Yeah, I think, Jeff, that it plays a role in a couple different ways. Some of that is in the falls into more of the risk bucket of making sure that data is not at risk to potential disclosures. There's also the avenue of making sure that the idea of good data in equals good data out, right? That there's some validation there that making sure that what you expect to get out from if you've developed some kind of homegrown AI chatbot, whether that's for internal use or employee use, right? A lot of these projects, most times you're going to start talking before you even develop it to how are we treating our data? Is it clean? Is it classified? Do we know the sensitivity of it? Um, Part of that is answering the equation around visibility. But realistically, the idea is that when you're developing an AI or leveraging an LLM internally, Your data is moving from system to system, or from user creates prompt to orchestration to backend infrastructure to retrieve some kind of answer, right? So because data is in motion so much in this process, you really want to know what kind of data um, is going to be expected, mostly because of you want to guardrail it, because you are going to be in some instances touching sensitive data. So guardrails are so important to make sure you know what data is being accessed, who or what is accessing it, and ultimately making sure that that data is not at risk to some potential threat, whether that's an indirect or direct prompt injection, jailbreaking, or data leakage.
Yeah, I mean, you started talking about, I think you're getting into there why data guardrails are such a top priority for AI security. I think if you drill down on that to a little bit more with those data guardrails, maybe why is that more, or maybe why what have we seen that is making people more aware of data and data guardrails being a necessity in AI than they ever have been before in just regular SaaS-based applications.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think at the end of the day, right, it's an idea of, static analysis versus things becoming more dynamic, right? So we've, for years in the cybersecurity space have done a ton of work to put access controls around data access. And, you know, realistically, this is brokering more into the NHI space and how identity as a whole is really evolving to be less human driven and more autonomous. And so because at the end of the day, you're allowing whether it's an agent or a chatbot to have the authentication to access data, there's a lot of trust that's happening in that relationship. And so in some part, again, you are relenting some of that control that you've traditionally depended on just human-based authentication and saying that's a static request. Where now it's you're trusting an agent to go and retrieve the proper information. And so you need to make sure that the guardrails are in place because you want to reduce the capability of leakage or hallucinated information or improper disclosure of that information.
That's great. And I think, you're touching on, as we continue on here, right into what we're going to talk about next, which is identity.
Yep.
And, the idea that AI brings with it a whole new realm of concerns around identity, and especially when you're talking about access to the data we're putting in AI. And I think um, anyone that has used a public LLM, hopefully for just personal use and not for business use, but anyone who has used that and maybe fought with an LLM on a day-to-day basis knows how the identity of an AI can go a little crazy with the data you give it at times, and drift and hallucinate, as we'll say, and using those public LLMs. But with that in mind, and how you're talking about identity shifting and access to that data and giving up control, how are AI agents and the idea of NHI, non-human identities, changing identity security as we think about it?
Yeah. I think this is really important, Jeff, because we have, over the last couple decades, right, shifted focus from being a predominantly human-driven authentication to going more right to where we have these identities that you would call non-human, right? So that could be a credential, it could be a service principal, a secret, an API, something, right, that is driving a request to authenticate access. And it goes back to that control plane, right? The more agent to agent communication that's occurring, the less control the human has around those interactions, and the more importance that visibility and active monitoring on those relationships becomes. So identity has become, started shifting more from a request to access to we need to make sure that the autonomous systems or agents are essentially playing nice together, right? Agent to agent communication is going to be very, very, very critical in the next coming years when it comes to transacting data in motion. And so we want to make sure that when we're scoping how to do identity access management in an ecosystem, right, that these agents are properly monitored because realistically speaking, non-human identities are, in my opinion, they're challenging to secure because we have gone from a place where lateral movement was a no-go, right? We have put tons of policies and technical controls in place over the last decade to restrict lateral movement to where now agent to agent communication is pretty much saying we're going to do lateral movement. We're going to allow systems to communicate to pass data. Oh, and the human's not going to be the vehicle of doing that. And so I think this starts as a visibility issue, right? Because we need to know what is connecting from app to app or AI to app or whatever it may be. And then from there, trickle down the potential guardrails to make sure that essentially those agents are protected against the OAuth's top 10 from an AI perspective.
Gotcha. I mean, so I think that's a very interesting concept, Matt, that you bring up there of when we've thought about people and kind of getting into the least privilege mindset, but maybe that shifts when it's programmatic. And we've just maybe got into a bad habit of not thinking about applications and by proxy AI is is a risk like people are and are not, you know, locking that down. So it's an interesting concept and I think an interesting mind shift that we have to take of thinking about in the AI world about what these NHI, what these AI agents are really doing, what they really are, what they really have access to. On this space, and I know identity is something near and dear to your heart when we talk about AI security, and probably what you view as one of the most important layers. What's the most common thing you see missed when addressing identity security with AI?
Yeah, I think it's a core principle, to be honest, and to me, it is that there is a system somewhere that is accessing your data, and you may not necessarily be able to say, I can control that system or that person, frankly, right? So if we look at this from the idea of, let's just say my organization developed a chatbot that sits on our website, right? There's a human that is coming to my website that is going to interact with that chatbot and put a prompt in. And that prompt is going to then traverse some kind of orchestration layer that accesses data in my infrastructure. And the reality is I can't always predict that the person who's interacting with that chatbot I'm going to be able to control what they're doing. I can put the guardrails in, but there's a litany of risk because my LLM and my orchestration is working to make a decision about what can be accessed without me involved. And that's dependent on training, that's dependent on configuration and setup. And so we need to make sure that we're watching this appropriately because we need to make sure that we understand who's accessing what, how it's accessing, how it's translating those prompts. That's a lot of authorization that's happening to allow access to something. And then you broker the agent to agent communication if you're leveraging different types of AIs to automate tasks internally. And it's just, you get the idea that I'm trying to paint is you get a creep of access and over permissive access very quickly if you don't properly scope secure by design into the implementation of these things.
And again, I think fantastic information there, Matt. And you start talking about how users, you're getting into now how users are interacting with this from an identity standpoint, and that goes again perfectly into when we talk about runtime protection and how we're interacting with prompts. So whether now we get down the space of, whether it's, maybe we haven't secured usage, but maybe we have, I think at any time in the process, whether it's something that we have deployed as an organization ourselves, or it's still something that's kind of in the wild. There's an avenue of what we need to think about runtime protection, and a big piece of that is when you start hearing and talking about is prompt injection, and what prompt injection means, both for those shadow AI moments as well as maybe the more controlled moments. So as we get into this, let's maybe talk a little bit from your standpoint of what is prompt injection to you? What do you think about when people are talking about prompt injection?
Yeah, so there's two forms of prompt injection. There's direct and indirect. You could think of this very similarly to like a SQL injection type of attack. Um, but the idea here, right, is that somebody can, whether it's an internal LLM or an external, a direct prompt injection would be that I went and I put some kind of request in that attempted to circumvent the controls and extract information that I should not get, or force the AI to do something that it's not supposed to do. And that's, you know, kind of hard, to be honest. That's when we talk about where if you were to talk about where there's the more concern, direct versus indirect in prompt injection, I would say indirect is probably going to be the one that's more concerning, that can do a lot more damage. So that would be like, let's say that I have an email, right, that I want to just get a summary of. And I take that email, I copy and paste it, and I put it into ChatGPT or whatever and say, give me a summary of this, right? Um, the, the indirectness could be you don't know if somebody just at such a simple level in that email wrote something as the form of trying to wrote anything and then just um, change the font color to white so it matches the background, right? And then all of a sudden you copied something, you put it into an LLM, and there is information or a request or something in that email that you did not know is there that now you just put into an LLM. And you don't know. So you have the problem of you don't know. And so that's a problem. And then you have the aspect of that was just put into a chatbot. We don't know what we don't know about is going to be put out. And I know that's a weird way to say it, but the idea is that you can hide things, people can hide things in messages. And we have looked at the ease of AI in using it and saying, oh, let me just blatantly trust, right? And we put information in there and we don't think about, is there something somewhere in this information that's actually designed to cause to cause an adverse reaction or to be malicious. And so the two big things is this ultimately is derived to lead to potential data leakage or try to jailbreak a model. And those are two risks that pose a lot of challenges to an organization because we take it back to the data, right? We need to make sure that that data is not improperly disclosed, and that at the end of the day, when we're leveraging AI, that the outcomes are as close to what we expect as possible, right? So protecting the prompt is critical to that. And that's for whether my internal users are trying to use a prompt or somebody is coming to a AI model that I've developed. And I want to make sure that their experience, or at least that they can't do something malicious against it. A popular instance of that is like McDonald's and Chipotle put chatbots on their sites. And there was a while that people were, instead of going and using Claude, were going and using their websites chatbots because they were able to ask it anything about generating code and it was just going off the rails, whatever anybody wanted it to do. And it wasn't just focusing on only answering questions about Chipotle or McDonald's, as crazy as that sounds, right?
Yeah, that I mean, I think there's some wild usages out there, and you hit on I think a very important thing of this. I think the advent of AI gives a much broader uh, brush stroke to what an individual, even an individual that you think in your organization may not have the access you think they do, may not have the knowledge you think they do, to that if you might say if they were compromised, there's nothing that they could do. But AI adds a whole new level to that when you start talking about injection and how, to your point, the indirect side, the unintentional side, how it's amplified of how harmful that could be into an organization, to the data, to individual users, of really just putting something in there they didn't know, mistyping a prompt, mistyping something. I mean, it's amazing how amplified some of this is with AI. Um, in your mind, like when we start talking about this, when we start talking about now, we're getting into the LLMs, the interactions with the LLMs themselves. Like, what are the ways we secure those, both either publicly or internal,
Yeah.
however they're deployed?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, you have to, before you even answer that question, you have to look at your knowledge users and your workforce, and you have to put them into categories of what does their interaction look like? Because the interaction from a developer's perspective can look very different from, say, Joe Smith in HR, right? And so you kind of need to do an audit of who your workforce is first, um, because that's going to dictate, in my opinion at least, what the best way to go about securing that interaction is. Um, there's a litany of tools out there that you can look at, whether it's going more of like the AI firewall route, right? Where it's this idea of, okay, we want to filter inbound and outbound prompt request at the perimeter. So the idea would be any stakeholder who's trying, whether that's going to use an AI assisted code generator or just using an LLM, we see that prompt on its way out and we can make sure that we put policy on that outbound. Or if it's inbound, we can do the same thing to protect the actual prompt layer that the human is interacting with. Um, the flip side of that is that could be overkill for organizations, depending on what your use case is, right? If it's more so your concern is internal, just to the people leveraging an LLM, there's tools out there that, whether it's your, endpoint security provider, can add it as a module onto your solution, or, some of these standalone, more governance like solutions that monitor the actual connections to LLMs from an app to app basis or a user to app basis. From there, you can put a pretty good preventative control plane around what somebody could actually do to an LLM. And that's more so to again to prevent that potential data leakage. I wouldn't call it full DLP. I go back to the data protection layer, but more so saying, putting the technical policies in place that allow you to dictate the type of experience that a person can have with an LLM.
Great insight, man. Appreciate that. And just want to remind everybody, as we're coming to kind of the bottom half of the hour here, and getting near the end of our presentation and our layers, that feel free. I see that we have a question in that we'll get to at the end, but if you have any questions, throw them out there, and we'll make sure to leave some time at the end to answer those if you do have them. So we've talked a lot, leading up to this point about, everything that goes into controlling how AI is used, who uses AI, the data going into AI, how those users are interacting with AI. But one of the big things I think to me is when we start talking about now the observability around AI, when we start talking about governance around AI, um, you know, I think governance is something, and it's just governance, risk, and compliance is something we've seen come up and rise in awareness over the last probably 3 or 4 years. Is when we've seen it come to a critical space of organizations being aware of GRC, but that kind of goes into the observability of AI as well, of knowing what my AI is doing so I can govern it. And we talk about, being able to know what's going on. Like what you talked a lot earlier about, we're kind of re- giving up control, giving up access, allowing AI agents, allowing interaction between agents to do a lot. We see and I mean, I've heard IT leaders and organizations talk about they see that in the next few years, they may have roles within an organization where they're only managing AI employees. And those AI employees are interacting with each other. Those AI employees are interacting with APIs, whether that be applications inside the business or outside the business. So now to keep governance and controls around all this, I think observability takes a really key point in kind of a first seat in this whole AI security adoption. So can you talk about that from your view, the importance of monitoring that agent to agent and agent to API communication as organizations mature in their AI rollout?
I I think you hit the nail on the head, Jeff. And the answer to that is it is the theme that ties all these layers together, right? Visibility in general is going to always be your greatest ally. Um, the the logistical challenges from a cybersecurity perspective when it comes to AI adoption is the pace is it's outpacing the defenders. And so there I have talked to a lot of stakeholders and organizations where the challenge is they want to develop. There is pressure from the C-suite to do AI. And the we have been trained as security professionals that we need to vet first. We need to do a risk management assessment around these things, and you absolutely should. There needs to be the practice of getting this more in line to the adoption, because the concern is that these people or developers, whoever it may be, are not going to wait around for that process, because the pressure is there to implement. So visibility is key, because you need to be able to assure that output is correct, assure that things are functioning as as they should, but also that you can tie all these other layers together, right? I need to make sure that in order to be able to attest to really any kind of governance, any kind of protection, I need to be able to know that the activity is happening. I need to know that agents are operating, and need to know, most importantly, that the data in motion is not at risk. That is all tying this together with the idea that visibility is going to give the insights that you need to be able to govern this whole process and really the life cycle. That is from human putting prompt in to the hitting the back end infrastructure to output in general.
And I think something on that you talk about is like that visibility. That visibility is important, especially when you start talking about, we're mentioning how this changes the risk profile, how AI can change the risk, how AI can change interactions. And that may be very important to organizations who are trying to understand how this impacts them from a standpoint of things like CMMC, HIPAA, SOC 2. There's I think this changes, again, because we're giving up some of the controls. It changes how this is viewed, how this is audited, how this is monitored? What are some things that, or maybe just talk overall about, GRC importance with maturing AI in an organization and what to watch out for there, how to handle that, and just how that shifts in this new world.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that data is still for many organizations their crown jewel of an asset, right? And so when you start from the idea of just, risk management 101, right? The first thing you do is identify what is important and what is critical, because that gives you the blueprint to understand how to treat it. It also puts a value on it, and the reality is when it comes to business impact, right? It is a dollars and a numbers game when it comes to the value and how to secure it, in a lot of instances. And so, you're really starting to see the emergence of a lot of things like the AI risk, NIST AI risk management framework, right? ISO 42001, these frameworks for how to properly secure or attest to secured AI usage. Um, those are going to grow in popularity. Um, and importance, frankly, we're seeing that already, really, with like kind of the first iteration. Jeff, you touched on it. I feel like SOC 2, just from my practitioner days, was always important. I think that's becoming even more important than it was, because people want to really, organizations really want to understand, if I'm buying your product, how are you treating my data? Are you using it to train? Um, where is my data at stake? Because it's constantly moving. It's constantly moving to be used for a function of the business. Um, and then even to the HIPAA and CMMC levels, right? There are real strategic conversations you need to be having around how you can leverage, I'll say, the most sensitive of datas that are highly regulated like that, because one mishap, right, you are opening yourself up to potential reputational damage, financial damage, um, deep ramifications that could impact the business, right? Um, because of how CUI is so sensitive, and healthcare information insensitivity as well. So I go back to, I need to know if that data is at risk at all times. And that goes back to visibility that is tied to governance and a GRC that is constantly evaluating the posture of that data.
That's great insight. Again, thanks, Matt, for that insight. And um, you know, as we come to the end here, looking at these five layers, just kind of in summary, there's a lot of ways that this can be dissected, and I will say that a lot of what we talked about today is the deployment of AI, AI applications, AI agents. Excuse me. That observability, even within this stack, there are further funnels that we'll probably look at a different time, where we haven't even talked about um, the other side of this, which is developing an AI. So we're talking more about AI usage in this stack, and protecting against that, because that's how we see a lot of organizations are going to be using this. But before I kind of summarize this, Matt, I'll say just maybe a high level summary on uh, maybe we're teasing a future state webinar here, but just some of the things that we're seeing also come up with on that development side, and that things like Claude Code are throwing in. If you have any thoughts on that before we summarize what we've talked about today.
Yeah, I think it's evolving. Particularly the solutions to secure those interactions. Um, you know, I feel like in general, developers and security professionals have had a love-hate relationship, because frankly, cybersecurity professionals in a lot of instances feel like the group of no a lot of times. And there's adoption on that side of the house to shift from more so being the people of you can't do, and more how do we inject security into just the functions of being part of the business. And so from the developer side of the house, um, I had a mentor tell me, one of the things that he was doing was shifting how he viewed his workforce to everybody could be a developer. And so that changes how he's going to be implementing technical controls. The big thing is AI generated code, right? Are we making sure the challenge there is, does everybody actually know what's being generated? Can they understand if, just because it works doesn't mean it should be used? Doesn't mean, asking the question, is it viable code that's not subject to some kind of vulnerability that could be taken advantage of at some point? So, that is going to be a conversation that continues to enrich, particularly because that's around the idea of productivity, right? But also innovation. And we want to enable people to be innovative. So when we talk about these guardrails, securing that, and securing these interactions, right, that is going to become an integral piece, not only from just the cost perspective of what it costs to use and, tokens in general, but making sure that any kind of AI generated code is clean, good code, if you will.
Hmm. Absolutely. And so, well, I say again, there's many ways that this can be broken down, and I think there's probably if you go look, you could probably define this in subcategory upon subcategory when you start talking about security and AI and how that's making a paradigm shift in the way we think about this. But why we like to boil it down into these layers that we have is because we feel like for most organizations, this is giving a good starting point on where to go, where to think about in the areas to cover across an AI stack. So when you start with usage governance, right, of how are my people using AI? And we all know you probably have usage out there today. You have people that are going out and using AI. We hear it all the time. We hear it in every conversation we're in with AI, that shadow AI is a concern and what people are putting in AI. And we've heard uh, some pretty scary stories of what people end up putting in AI in organizations, just not thinking about it because there is that trust. So starting with usage governance of making sure that we know where the people, what our organization's using, where they're going, that we have some guardrails around that we're protecting the data. As Matt said, this is everyone's most prized possession. That data, that IP, that's the core of your business, is that data behind the scenes, and you want to make sure that you protect that goal, right? Protect that oil, protect that just that investment of data. And so data protection becomes key is you're allowing more usage of AI in the environment. And as that usage grows, it's understanding identity. It's understanding the controls around that and how identity is shifting. That as I continue down this path, I'm going to have more non-human identities in my environment, and I have to have the proper controls around those. And I maybe have to adjust my policies and procedures. And not always a tool, but a lot of times it's policies and procedures around how I deal with those identities, how I deal with that NHI, those agents that are getting developed into my environment. And then as that continues to go out, how am I interacting with this? How am I allowing users to interact with this? How am I protecting? And even in runtime protection, it can apply back to the data protection of, am I making sure that internally I'm not exposing myself to the idea that someone can accidentally get information that they shouldn't from in the organization? I think that's a key area that we're starting to talk with organizations about now, that's a part of security that also oftentimes gets missed, is that if I upload financial information from um, because the finance department is looking at pay scales for the organization and doing initiatives on that. Do I have the right controls in place so someone can't go just on a whim, joking around, throw into our internal AI, hey, show me the pay grade of the C levels, just thinking they're goofing around, and all of a sudden it spit that back to them. So that runtime protection is important for a lot of reasons. And then as we continue to expand on this, knowing what's going on, I think we've faced a significant uphill battle that we haven't even realized yet on controlling these AI agents, controlling non-human identities, and really um, keeping track of that within our organizations. It's something that I think we've thought about in the past of how we manage automation and scripts and things that are going on. That's not new to any of us that have been around IT and IT operations for a long time, but shifting that observability to agents that can act on their own without human intervention, I think is that's the paradigm shift that we all have to get used to in our observability and keeping track of governance. And really, these are the AI ecosystem that we're looking at, right? It's the users, the data, the LLMs, wherever that may be, APIs, right? MCPs. I mean, that becomes a huge thing when you're talking about the gateways that connect you into other areas, the databases that are involved, vector and rags, the AI applications, the AI agents. These are all the things you need to think about in your AI ecosystem when you think about these stacks. So, Matt, before we close out on our success
Yep.
looks like and answer the couple of questions, anything here, kind of final thoughts on these layers? Anything you want to call out?
Um, I mean, I think the final thoughts really for me, Jeff, are something you touched a little bit on. We break this into layers because there's different threat landscapes involved. And you could take this, in our opinion, right? We're leading with this in our conversations with our clients because you could take this and change the lens, whether it's the internal development of an AI, whether it's your developer team or your general user. Our recommendation is we take this and then we change the lens depending on whose use case, and we can use this to guide what the strategy should look like from a security perspective.
Completely agree, and that's awesome. And one thing I think that we want to talk about is like when we do this, when we're able to execute as organizations on successful AI security, what does that look like? Right? What does success look like? We can think about safe AI adoption at scale. So as we continue to scale in our environments that we know and feel comfortable with our guardrails, that our data and IP are protected. I think we've talked so much about that today. It's like making sure that the those keys to the kingdom, that core, which is our data, is protected, that we have secure agents and identities, that we know who is who, we know what's going on with the NHI. We have all of that locked down. Threats are detected and stopped, whether that be a direct threat, an indirect threat, um, someone acting maliciously, or just someone acting out of curiosity, that we're protecting ourselves against that. That we have regulatory confidence, right? That we make sure that we're keeping up with those regulatory in governance frameworks that we as organizations we all have to deal with, and that AI maybe puts a little bit of a hurdle into how we're dealing with that, especially with data access. And then if we can do that, then the business value of AI can be realized. So one of the things I want to touch on before I get to the question that's in the chat is that, as we talk about this with organizations. This is not just, you can imagine, right? Just like with anything in security, this is not just one tool. Sometimes it's not even tools, right? It's policy, it's procedure. There's adoptions of new tools, adoptions of new framework. It could be anything from an assessment based on, Matt mentioned, like a NIST risk assessment around AI and policies there, to expanding tooling you already have, to new tooling that comes into the environment. So this is going to be something that's unique for each organization, and something we'd love to dive in with everyone and talk about when interested. I have one question in the chat that was from back from the beginning. What impact or impacts do you expect if an organization skips phase 0 or even phase 0 and phase 1? What are the biggest reasons why orgs would skip certain phases? Can organizations be successful in successfully adopting AI by skipping phases? If so, how? And so that question came back when we were talking about this, which is kind of a framework that Opkalla put together. And in this framework, so you can certainly skip phases. We see that happen. I think this is something that we put together to say in a perfect greenfield environment, if you could, you would want your AI to go in this fashion where you've put in the guardrails, you've done those security measures that we talked about, so that as you continue down the path of putting in data lakes, and then getting to operationalization of putting in those point products all the way to strategic impact where you're doing more custom development, that you feel secure, that you don't have data silos, that you have data spread out in multiple areas, that your products you put in, your point products that are more of that AI operationalization, that they are plugging into your guardrails and helps make maybe have the organization make selections of those easier when you're selecting products. And then when you're developing, right, that all of this is in place, so you can develop against that. You can develop against sound data sets, data that's ready in a secure fashion. Perfect world, right? And we know everybody doesn't operate this. So this is not meant to be a hard and fast, you can only be successful if you do it this way. It's just meant to be a way that we can meet our customers where they are, find out what phase they're ultimately operating in, what phase they may have skipped, and help them go back and put some of those building blocks in if needed to ultimately get to that strategic impact. So could you do this and skip phases and jump around and still be successful? Yes, you could. I think that just comes with more work at the end. If you're jumping around and haven't put all the security guardrails in, if you go to do strategic impact of developing apps, then you might have a lot of work to go back and put some of those guardrails in place. So it might be a little harder to implement some of those if they were not already there. Getting your data and the AI foundations around your data set may be a little bit harder if, I've skipped over that and I have all these all these custom built applications that are throwing data everywhere. I have point products that I've brought in that are throwing data everywhere. Now my data is still in silos. I may have a tougher time of getting that strategic impact. So it's not to say that you can't jump around and be successful, but we feel like you need to think about these things that ultimately, if you're trying to get the strategic impact, you want to address these other phases as much as possible to make it easier in your organization. So hopefully that helps answer that question that came in from Brian. So I don't see any other questions at this point. Matt, how about we talk about, as we close this out, next steps for anyone that maybe wants to follow up and from this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, right, the reference at the beginning of this, presentation, Jeff, we have a few talk tracks that we do, whether that's around our unified kill chain, or even, more centered around this, right? Our AI and data talk track that you or myself run, with more of that phased approach from guardrailing to adoption and what that looks like. But also, soon to come, we are going to be putting a specific AI security workshop out that we'd be more than happy to run with clients.
Fantastic. So I appreciate everyone for joining. You will get a follow-up from our team that will have a link that you can respond if you would like to schedule some time to go through these talk tracks and go through this conversation in a more personal way to your organization, to dive into these layers, or to dive into, again, our phased approach around AI and AI as a whole, and talk about how that looks for your specific organization. And we can really dive into more specific tools, services, resources, policy, procedure that might impact you. So hopefully everyone found this helpful, that you maybe learned something today, or taking something away from it that you can take back to your organization. We appreciate everyone joining us again on the end of the month, Tuesday morning. Have a good rest of the week. Happy 4th to everyone. Hope everyone has a good long weekend and enjoys some time with friends and family.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jeff.